Hi everyone, this is Noah Sandler from MTGO Academy, and today I'm going to be bringing you my Eternal Masters limited review. We're going to look at the black cards, and I'm going to start things off with Animate Dead. It's 1 and a black aura. You bring back a creature from either graveyard, and that creature gets -1, -0. And if they remove Animate Dead, the creature also goes to the graveyard. So the upside on the card is you can get some really large creatures in play for just 2 mana. So looking at the most broken things you can do with it, in this format, you could play turn 1 Entomb for Inkwell Leviathan, and then Animate Dead on turn 2, so you've got a 6/11 Trampling Island Walk Shroud, and that's basically the game. And there are some other good creatures you can reanimate with it to get a large creature in play early, and then just hope to beat your opponent with it before they find removal. Unfortunately, there actually is a lot of cheap removal in this format, so that's not a great plan. If you're just getting like a Havoc Demon, so you get a 5/5 flyer into play early, there's a decent chance your opponent can remove it. So if you invested a lot of resources in trying to pull that off, that might not be the best. I mean, it's a good way to play Animate Dead, but it might actually be better just to use it more for value. I think one of the best plays is just land cycle Twisted Abomination on turn 2, and turn 3 Animate Dead the Abomination, leaving up a black for regeneration. So you got a 4/3 regenerator on turn 3, and that's a lot harder to get rid of. And you get a land out of the deal. Since Abomination's common, that's pretty easy to pull off. There's also the Shoreline Ranger in blue that you can do the same thing with, though it's not quite as powerful. But also you can use Animate Dead on your value creatures, creatures with coveted play abilities. So you can actually just get a Gravedigger back, get another creature, get Mana War, Phyrexian Rager, Nekrataal, just get a little bit of value out of it. For 2 mana, it's certainly worth it. And on top of that, it combos well with cards like Hymn to Tourach. So if your opponent discards a big creature or something with a great come to play ability, you can Animate Dead it, and it's just great value for 2 mana. The -1, -0 isn't that relevant. If you're getting come to play abilities, it doesn't matter too much. And if your creature is large, creatures tend to be kind of small in this format, so 1 less power probably is going to make a big difference, turning a 5/5 into a 4/5. So it's a good combo card for like a blue-black or black-red reanimating style of deck. But it's also just such a good value card that I would rarely cut it from any black deck. You're going to have removal, you kill their best creature and steal it, maybe some discard. So I think it's just generally a very good card, and I'm going to give it a B+. Next up is Annihilate. 3 and 2 black, instant, destroy target non-black creature, it can't be regenerated, and draw a card. So this is a very easy 2-for-1. Instant speed, as long as it's not a black creature, you kill their best creature and draw a card. So that's really good. It costs 2 mana more than Blight's Ending, but being able to package it with a card draw is just really powerful, and I think that makes it the better card. Not too much else to say about it. It's just a really strong removal spell, and I'm going to give it a B+. Next up, we have Blightsoil Druid. 1 and a black, 1/2. You can tap it, pay a life, add a green mana to your mana pool, and it's an elf. So in your average black deck, I feel like you're not too interested in ramping. You can slow the game down with your early cheap removal spells, maybe with the Phyrexian Rager to trade off. So like playing a weak creature in order to ramp, I feel like doesn't fit the deck too well. And then also you have to pay life, and there's a lot of cards in black that you're going to pay life for. So it's kind of marginal in those decks. I think it's perfectly fine in the black-green elf deck, because you're just trying to get to a critical mass of elves, and getting the green mana, being able to ramp out a little bit, I think is more valuable in that deck. So I think it's fine there, but otherwise I'm probably not playing this in my other black decks. So I'm going to give it a C-. Now we have Blood Artist. 1 and a black, it's a 0/1. Whenever Blood Artist or another creature dies, target player loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. So I'm usually pretty hesitant to put in cards that can't attack or immediately affect the board. I would be a little bit skeptical of Blood Artist in general, but actually in this format, I think it's great. So there is just the red-black Aristocrats deck that's taking advantage of sacrifice effects, and that can really add up. Just a couple drains here, a couple drains there. If you get like 4 or 5 through the course of the game, you're pretty happy. And also Blood Artist just chumps and drains, so once you're done with it, you might gain an extra 5 life just from blocking a 4/4. It can be great with mass removal. There's a lot of mass removal in this format. So if you play Blood Artist and then a Crater Hellion, it removes a board and you get an extra drain for 5 out of it. And as with other engine cards that gain life, gaining life buys you time, which you use that time to continue the engine. So you're going to have more time to draw more creatures are going to die, and it all kind of cycles itself and just keeps the game going and lets you continue to get more value out of the card. And then if you're just trading creatures off, like a few 2/2s with their 2/2, you drain for 2, you play a Gravedigger, get it back. It just adds a lot of value. And it's a card that your opponent is probably going to want to remove. And if you're facing one, you should probably just kill it immediately. It might actually be your opponent's biggest threat, even though it doesn't seem like it at the time. So I'm going to give Blood Artist a B-. Next up is Braid's Cabal Minion. 2 and 2 black, 2/2 legend. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player sacrifices an artifact, creature, or land. So the best case scenario for this card is you're on the play usually, and you play it on turn 4 after playing maybe a creature on turn 2 or 3, and your opponent had a slow draw. Maybe they have a creature in play, maybe they just played a couple gain lands, and suddenly they have to sacrifice either their only creature or sacrifice one of their lands, and they have to do that every turn for the rest of the game, so you might just lock them out of ever getting to 4 or 5 mana. And so, maybe they'll find a removal spell for Braids, but if they don't, you might have just won the game. So you want to find a way to set that up if possible. So the cheaper your deck is, the faster you can just get permanents on the board. Something like Mogg War Marshal is amazing with Braids. And then just removal spells. If you remove your opponent's creatures, then they're going to have to sacrifice lands to Braids, and you can lock them out that way. Considering there is the Black-Red Aristocrats deck, Braids goes well there. There's just a lot of card advantage, Phyrexian Rager, Gravedigger, that you can take advantage of, what would seem like a balanced effect. So Braids is actually quite good. It's not quite as good on the draw. If you're facing a tokens deck, it's actively terrible. So it is a little bit situational, but potentially very powerful. So I'm going to give Braids a B-. Next up is Cabal Therapy. 1 black, sorcery. Name an on-land card. Target player reveals his or her hand and discards all cards with that name. You can flash it back by sacrificing a creature. So it's typically not a very good main deck card because you're not going to be able to guess what cards that they have very frequently in Game 1. But it does have the flashback, so if you have a lot of aristocrat style, like Dragon Egg, cards that want to be sacrificed, or a lot of token creatures, then even though you miss with the first one the majority of the time, you're guaranteeing that you're going to be able to hit with the second one by sacrificing a weak creature. So in that case, it plays kind of like a Duress, and so it can be okay. And then after sideboard, it gets a little better because you've seen some cards out of your opponent's deck, and you'll know if there are some really key things that you want to hit. Maybe a card that you saw 3 copies of, and you feel like you're probably going to hit one the first time, and maybe you'd hit a couple, and then with the flashback you could hit something else. So it does have some potential, and I mean the better you are at figuring out what your opponent might likely have based on how they've played the game and what other cards you've seen, it makes the card a little bit better. But it is kind of high variance. I don't like playing cards that have a chance of blanking. Considering you have to sacrifice a creature to replay it, you are giving your opponent a 2-for-1 a lot of the time. So I'm not a big fan of the card in general, but sometimes it's necessary because your opponent just has some things that you have to have an answer to. So I'm going to give it a C-. Next card is Carrion Feeder, 1 black. It's a 1/1 that can't block. You can sacrifice a creature to put a +1/+1 counter on it. So not being able to block is a huge disability for creatures. I mean, one great thing about just any creature that you play is your opponent attacks with a 5/5 ground creature, you can throw your creature in front and buy yourself some more time. And Carrion Feeder can't do that. And so that's a very real handicap of this card. So you're going to use it aggressively, so in a deck that wants to be attacking a lot early, but mostly in decks that have ways to take advantage of sacrificing creatures. So Dragon Egg, if you have Mogg War Marshal, lots of tokens sitting around, eventually the feeder could grow to be pretty large. Whenever your opponent plays a removal spell on another creature, you can sacrifice it to feeder. Once it's at least a 3/3, you're pretty happy. You paid 1 mana, and you have a 3/3 that can't block. That's pretty good. I think it also has nice applications against decks that have pacifism, control magic, second thoughts, exile effects, because it lets you keep your creatures in your graveyard where you're able to reanimate them or get them back somehow. So I think it can be nice there too. You want to have a pretty high creature count. If this is your only creature in play, or just like a late game draw, it's pretty weak. Yeah, it can be good. I think it's really deck dependent, so I'm going to give it a C+. It is a very key player in that red-black sacrifice deck, though. Next up, we have Deadbridge Shaman, 2 and a black, 3/1 elf. When it dies, target opponent discards a card. So this can actually play similarly to Phyrexian Rager in that it's going to trade for something and you get a card out of it. But your opponent chooses to discard the card, so that's a little worse. And because it has 1 toughness, maybe it'll just trade with a token. So it does have some downsides. It's nice that it's an elf, can just fill out your elf count in the black-green deck. And it's a creature that trades off pretty easily. I mean, it does have 3 power, so if you just keep attacking with it, your opponent is going to need to stop it at some point. It's not something that they can just ignore. If you're playing lots of Gravedigger effects, it's nice to have a creature that is easy to get in the graveyard and gives you some value that you can get back and start the chain. So I think it's a pretty solid card, and definitely better in elf decks, but it's perfectly fine filler for any deck, so I'm going to give it a C. Next card is Duress, 1 black, sorcery, target opponent reveals his or her hand, you choose a non-creature, non-land card from it, and they discard it. So this is actually a pretty good format for Duress. There's a lot of really powerful non-creature cards, there's really good removal, Hondens, some really powerful broken enchantments. So it's a good spot for Duress. I think it's an okay main deck card. Now, there is a chance that you miss with it. There's a chance your opponent has a high creature count deck. So a lot of times you will leave it in your sideboard. It's a notoriously weak, late game top deck once your opponent has emptied their hand. But it's a great sideboard card. Once you see that your opponent has cards that you need to deal with, cards that black typically has trouble dealing with, like Hondens or enchantments. This gives you a way to actually get rid of them. Now, as far as playing the card, it's usually best not to cast it on turn 1 if you have it, because most of the things that you want to hit are in the 3, 4, and 5 range, the really powerful stuff. And every turn that you wait on Duress, your opponent has 1 extra card that they've seen that they could have drawn into that card. So it helps once you've seen a little bit of their deck and you know which cards you're targeting with the Duress, what you're trying to hit. And it's best usually to go for Duress on the turn right before they could cast that card. So if you're trying to hit a Honden, like the white Honden, you want to cast Duress on turn 3. On the other hand, you also want to look at your curve. So if you have a 3-drop and nothing else to do on turn 1 and 2, you're going to want to cast Duress on turn 2 and just play your 3-drop. Like, you wouldn't want to mess up your curve just to see 1 more card for your Duress. But with a little bit of finesse, you can find the right spot to get the highest chance of actually hitting the card that you're trying to get. So I'm going to give Duress AC. Up next is Entomb, 1 black instant. Search your library for a card and put that card into your graveyard, then shuffle your library. So this card is potentially very powerful. I've already gone over the Animate Dead, Inkwell Leviathan, Entomb combo. It's unlikely, but it's worth noting that this card can do some really sick things. Now, in the general case, looking at this set as a whole, how often are you going to play this card for value, and how often are you going to be able to do something crazy with it? I think it's unlikely to do crazy things. There are a few good reanimation spells like Animate Dead, but there's only so many amazing creatures to get, and even the ones that you can get, if it's not Inkwell Leviathan, there are a lot of cheap removal spells that can kill them. So if you're just using Entomb and then Animate Dead on your Havoc Demon, and they play Swords of Plowshares, you use two. You got 2 for 1. I think you are more looking for cards like Roar the Worm, which can be 4 mana, get a 6/6, so 5 mana total after using Entomb. So that's a pretty good one. Though black-green decks probably aren't going to have too many cards like that. I mean, they'll have 1 Roar the Worm, and if you just have 1 Roar the Worm, if you draw it, the Entomb is going to be useless. So you want to have a few cards you can grab with it to make it worthwhile. Deep Analysis is a decent one. If you Entomb for it, you basically spent 3 mana and 3 life to draw 2 cards, and that's decent. That's a worse divination, but it's okay. Also, Call the Skybreaker. That's a pretty good card to get in your graveyard. But overall, there's just not too much value to doing that. So I think unless if you really get a sick combo or have just a lot of things to take advantage of it, which there just aren't that many in the set, I think it's just not something that you're going to be playing. So I'm going to give it a D+. Next, we have my pick for best black common. It's Blight's Ending, 2 and a black. It's an elf instant, and you destroy target non-elf creature. So, the vast majority of creatures in this set are non-elves, and so in the majority of cases, 3 mana, instant, kill any creature, and that's just great. When you're facing an elf deck, it still can be okay. If they're black-green, they could have something like Visara, Sylvos, Emperor Crocodile is pretty common in those decks. So they usually don't run all elf creatures. So while you wouldn't want to have multiple Blight's Endings in your deck in that case, having 1 can still be okay. If they are heavy on elves, like you see only elves in the first game, and you have other ways of dealing with a large creature, like Tragic Slip, then I think you could sideboard out Blight's Ending in that matchup. But typically you're just going to leave it in, and that's still a rare circumstance that you're actually facing against a complete elf deck. So in almost every circumstance, it's going to be a really good card. So I'm going to give it a B+. Next up is Gravedigger, 3 and a black. It's a 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, you may return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So Gravedigger is a great value creature. Getting a creature out of your graveyard is typically just better than drawing a card, because you could get the best creature that's died that game. Usually that's going to be better than a random card. It's cool if you can get multiple Gravediggers going. You can trade one off Gravedigger to get one back. When the new one dies, play Gravedigger again, get it back, and you've got infinite 2/2s to trade off. And that also works well with Urborg Uprising. If you have that and a Havoc Demon, your opponent kills the demon, you play Gravedigger for the demon, trade the Gravedigger off, play the demon, they kill it, you play Uprising, get both back, the demon, the Gravedigger, the demon. So it just gives you this really good card advantage engine. So it's just a very powerful card. Goes great with other cheap come to play ability cards like Nekrataal, and it's just a cornerstone of the grindy black deck, which I think is going to be really powerful in this format. So Gravedigger gets a B. Next we have Havoc Demon, 5 and 2 black, 5/5 flying. When it dies, all creatures get -5/-5 until end of turn. So 7 mana for a 5/5 flying is a bit overcosted, and this is a format where there are removal spells, really cheap ones, that could get rid of this without triggering its effects. Swords to Plowshares, Pacifism, Second Thoughts if you're attacking, or a Silent Departure can just about neutralize it, bouncing it for 2 turns. So this card doesn't quite have bomb status, but I think in some decks it can still be a very good card. If you have a lot of removal, and I think most black decks are going to fall into that category, you just have a lot of removal, a lot of discard, you grind the game, and eventually your opponent's just left with nothing. Then you play Havoc Demon, and you just win with it. And the game is going to go long, so getting to 7 mana isn't that difficult. And if they do kill it, it does Wrath the board, -5, basically kills everything in this format. And then you can play reanimation spells, get it back, and then just keep doing that until your opponent has nothing left, and then it wins the game. So I don't think it's going to make the cut in every black deck. If you're aggressive, then you just don't want to play it. But it's nice for Reanimator, and it's nice for just grindy, removal heavy decks. So I'm going to give it a B-. Next up is one of my favorite cards in the set. It's Honden of Night's Reach, 3 and a black, legendary enchantment shrine. At the beginning of your upkeep, target opponent discards a card for each shrine you control. So I think this is just about on par, I think a little bit worse than the blue Honden. And I think it's in a similar category in that it's very strong on its own and doesn't benefit too much from having multiple shrines in play relative to the other shrines. It is matchup dependent. If you're facing a really aggressive deck, it's not quite as good, but it can be so amazing if you're in a grindy control mirror matchup. You play this on turn 4, and both players' plans are just to trade 1 for 1 over and over again until the other person's out of cards. And Honden means your opponent will run out of cards trying to do that. So it is just the key card in those types of matchups. Your opponent might end up discarding 7 cards from your Honden over the course of the game. And it forces them, once they've discarded their whole hand, they have no cards in their hand, they've got to play every card they draw the turn they draw it. And so they're not going to get the best value out of the removal spells. They're going to have to just play it on whatever you have out. And usually these games are about saving your best removal spells for the right moment and just grinding out a slow advantage. So Honden is amazing in those matchups. And in just about any matchup, if you're playing a control-ish deck, you want to grind your opponent down on cards. And the Honden does that. You just trade 1 for 1 with your removal spells, while the Honden just keeps plugging away at their hand, and then eventually they're out of cards, and you can take control of the game and win. So, big fan of this Honden in this set, and I'm going to give it a B. Hymn to Tourach. 2 black, sorcery, target player discards 2 cards at random. So, this card is so much better than Mind Rot. And you can compare it to Divination as well. For 3 mana, drawing 2 cards, for 2 mana, making someone discard 2 cards at random is actually typically better than just drawing 2 cards. Because the cards are random, Hymn can actually be played as a very powerful card at any point that your opponent has 2 cards in their hand, at least. Like if they have 5 cards in their hand, you can still very easily hit the best or second best card out of their hand, compared to Mind Rot, where they're just going to keep the best 3 cards in their hand. So discarding 2 at random is really, really powerful. And beyond that, I think what makes it really powerful, especially when you're facing against good players, is that it messes up your opponent's plan. So, like the hallmark of good players is that they're going to be thinking many turns ahead, and they're going to be making plays to set up future plays. And Hymn to Tourach just destroys that plan. If you hit a key card, and they had been spending multiple turns trying to set up the situation to get the best value for that card, that can just lose them the game. And hitting random cards, I don't know, from my experience, you tend to hit good cards. So you can also hit lands with it. So you can mana screw somebody with this card. So even him on turn 2, when your opponent has like 6 cards in hand, you could just hit the only land in their hand. So you can play it at any time. I mean, it still is best if they have exactly 2 cards in their hand. But I feel like, unlike Mind Rot, where you want to wait until they have 2 cards, I think you just want to play him whenever you have the mana for it. And it just does a really good job disrupting your opponent's plays. So it's double black. You got to be committed to black to play it, but it's really powerful. So I'm going to give it an A-. Next up is Ichorid, 3 and a black, 3/1 haste. At the beginning of the end step, sacrifice Ichorid. At the beginning of your upkeep, if it's in your graveyard, you can exile a black creature card from your graveyard to bring it to the battlefield. So you can cast it for 4 mana, you attack with a 3/1 haste, your opponent could throw a creature in front or take 3 damage, and then on a future turn, you bring it back, depending on how many black creature cards you have in your graveyard, so you can hit for 3 again. It's sort of similar to Hellspark Elemental, which was a 3/1 trampling haste with Unearth. That would be for 4 mana. You'd basically get 2 attacks with a 3/1 trampler, and that card was pretty good, but you have to be in a really aggressive deck since you're not getting card advantage out of it. Now, Ichorid is in a set with some aristocrat themes, so you could sacrifice it to an Innocent Blood after you attack with it, or to Carrion Feeder, so you could get some value every time you bring it back. But it's just mostly just an aggressive card. I don't think it fits too well with what black is trying to do, and because you have to exile a black creature from your graveyard to get it back, that disrupts your reanimation. And there's just so many good black reanimation spells in the set, so I just don't think that's what you want to be doing with those cards. So Ichorid's a card that I don't think I'm going to play at all in this format, and I'm going to give it a D-. Next up is Innocent Blood. It's a black mana sorcery. Each player sacrifices a creature. So the typical way to take advantage of this otherwise balanced effect is just to not have a creature in play. If you have other removal, effects like Nausea, ways to remove small creatures, you want to get your opponent's biggest creature with it. So you play in such a way to get rid of their small creatures, leave them with 1 big creature and you with no creatures, and then Innocent Blood is 1 mana, kill target creature, basically. I think the card has a good place in the Black-Red Aristocrats deck. So you play it with Dragon Egg, you get your 2/2 flyer, your opponent sacrifices a creature. And if you're also playing a deck that just has very few creatures yourself, in the early game you're just not going to have a creature in play, then it's a 1 mana Edict effect, which is fine. But I don't think it's something that you're going to want to play in your average black deck. So it can be quite good in Aristocrats, but mostly filler in other decks. So I'm going to give it a C. Next up, we have Lys Alana Scarblade, 2 and a black, 1/1 elf. You can tap it, discard an elf. Target creature gets -X until end of turn, where X is the number of elves you control. So it's an elf itself, which means that you're immediately going to get -1/-1 for the effect. And that's going to make it similar to Plague Witch. But having more elves in play, and there are elf token makers like Lys Alana Huntmaster, you can take out bigger creatures, and at a certain point you can basically kill any creature, so it turns every elf card you draw into a Terminate. So it can be quite good in that situation. It is fragile with just 1 toughness, and those elves that you discard otherwise would be good just to play, so you can get more elves out. So, I mean, there is a trade-off. I mean, you're certainly glad to discard cards to kill creatures, but you are just putting a 1/1 for 3 mana in your deck. This is a card that is going to go pretty late. Only the black-green elf decks are going to want this card, so I don't think you have to draft it too highly. But if you really get the critical mass of elves, where just most of the cards in your deck are elves, then I think this card's pretty good. So I'm going to give it a C-. Next up, we have an amazing removal spell, Malicious Affliction. 2 black, instant, morbid. When you cast it, if a creature died this turn, you may copy it and choose a new target for the copy, and it says destroy target non-black creature. So, by itself, 2 mana, destroy target non-black creature at instant speed is really, really good removal. And the potential to actually hit 2 creatures, and it's not that hard to do that, makes this card really amazing. Now, in order to do this without too much other help, you usually need to trade a creature off, maybe on your opponent's turn. They attack, you maybe just chump block with your creature, they play another threat, and then you affliction the creature you chump blocked and their new threat. Now, if you're facing a black deck, they might not have 2 non-black creatures in play to hit with it, so I suppose it gets a little weaker, but you're still, if you just play it and kill 1 creature with it, you're very happy. And then it just has a lot of upside. It's instant, and can just wreck your opponent's board. So, very powerful card. I'm going to give it an A-. Next we have Nausea, 1 and a black, sorcery. All creatures get -1/-1 until end of turn. So I think it's an okay main deck card. As filler, not something you're excited to play. But there are a lot of 1-toughness creatures in this format, so you're hoping to just get a 1-for-1, as the floor. If your opponent never plays a 1-toughness creature, it could be weak. But there are some instances where you could attack some smaller creatures into bigger ones, and then use Nausea to finish their bigger creatures off. So even if they don't have 1-toughness creatures, it can still be okay. But what you're really hoping for is to hit multiple creatures with it. If you're facing the red-white tokens deck, this card can be so insane. It's just such a great answer to any of their cards that create multiple tokens, and you could get a 3-for-1 with it. I'd play 4 or 5 copies if I could against the red-white tokens deck. So it's actually a really good sideboard card. It's also good against elves and the blue-white flyers deck. So this is one of those sideboard cards that you really want to pick up at least 1 copy, because it's going to be so good in the matchups that it's good in. So, not a card you want to main deck, but I think it's a very solid sideboard card, so I'm going to give it a C-. Next up, and boy, I hate this card, Necropotence. 3 black enchantment, skip your draw step. Whenever you discard a card, exile that card, and you can pay 1 life, exile top card of your library face down, put that card into your hand at the beginning of your next end step. So, I played this card in Standard a really long time ago, in the late 90s, and the card was amazing. It was a great constructed card. You'd play it with a lot of life gain, and just go through your deck, play Drain Life, Corrupt, get the life back, draw more cards. The card was really, really broken. But ever since then, people have been putting this card in their cubes, and I have been faced with the decision of, should I pick this card? Should I play it? So many times since then, and in a few limited formats that it's reoccurred in. And I do not like this card for limited, or for cube. So first of all, 3 black is a very prohibitive casting cost for what is already a very situational card. So a lot of times you're just not going to get to the triple black, you can't cast it, and when you do get to triple black, you're at a point where you don't have enough life left to really take advantage of the Necropotence effect. And while this card can draw a lot of cards, you have to skip your draw step every turn, which means that every turn that passes, you're -1 card. And so if you play it, you draw 7 cards, next turn you skip your draw step. So you basically drew 6 cards, and then each turn after that, you had only drawn 5 cards, had only drawn 4, and so you need this really big burst of these cards that you draw to win you the game, and you only have a few turns to do it in. Now, drawing a lot of cards certainly can win you a game, but if your opponent has pressure on you, your life total already goes down a little low, it's relatively easy to get necrolocked, where you basically just are stuck. You're not going to draw a card for the rest of the game, you don't have enough life to spend to draw more cards, and you just lose the game. So it's just such a commitment and such a high-risk card that I just don't like playing this card in Limited. And I wouldn't recommend for you to try it either. Does have a lot of potential. I can't say that this won't really win a few games here and there, but I just hate playing the card. So since this is my review, I'm going to give Necropotence a D-. Next up, I get a little bit of relief, a card that I do absolutely adore. It's Nekrataal, 2 and 2 black, 2/1 with first strike. When it enters the battlefield, destroy target non-artifact non-black creature. That creature can't be regenerated. There aren't that many artifact creatures in the format, so that's not going to come up too much. Non-black will come up sometimes, but even black decks will have targets for Nekrataal in their secondary color. So in a vacuum, this card is great. You kill your opponent's best creature, and then you get a 2/1 first strike. And 2/1 first strike is actually very relevant. This is a format with a lot of 2/2s with come into play effects, and this just holds all of them off. Holds off tokens. It's just such a great blocker, and frequently will require a removal spell from your opponent so that they can start pushing through. And then black has such great reanimation spells in this format, and Nekrataal is just one of the best creatures to reanimate. You play Gravedigger, get the Nekrataal back, kill your opponent's next best creature, then they have to deal with a 2/1 first strike again. The card is just amazing. It's abusable, so powerful. So I'm going to give it an A-. Next up, we have Night's Whisper, 1 and a black, sorcery. You draw 2 cards, and you lose 2 life. So giving it the divination test, 2 cards for 3 mana. This is 2 cards and 2 life and 2 mana. So it's actually going to be better than divination in most cases. With black, you do have to be a little concerned. There are a lot of lose life effects. So if you get too many of them, each one starts to get a little bit worse. But the fact that you can play this on turn 2, especially on the play, you won't have to discard. And then you can start curving out into a 3-drop that starts affecting the board. I think it plays better than divination. So it's a very solid card. You're happy to play it in any black deck. What deck doesn't want to draw cards? So I'm going to give it a C+. Next up is Phyrexian Gargantua, 4 and 2 black, 4/4. When it enters the battlefield, you draw 2 cards and you lose 2 life. So it's sort of similar to Muldrifter. It's a relevant creature that draws 2 cards when you play it. Again, losing 2 life. If you run too many of these types of cards, it can add up and you can lose to aggressive decks. But a 4/4 body is actually quite big in this format. And if you just have removal to back it up, it can finish the game. And then, yeah, I mean, getting a 2-for-1 or make that a 3-for-1 out of the card, considering that there are reanimation effects, so you can get value even after it dies, makes this card quite good. It is a 6-drop. It doesn't have land cycling, so that makes it a little clunky, and I'd be a little hesitant to spend a first pick on it. So for other cards that have a similar rating, I might take them over this early in a draft if they're cheaper. But once you're late in the draft and your deck isn't too clunky, then it's a very good card for black. So I'm going to give it a B-. Next up is Phyrexian Rager, 2 and a black. It's a 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. So this card is really good. 2/2 trades for a lot of things in this format. Losing 1 life is really not a big deal. So you get a 2/2 and you draw a card for 3 mana. So it just kind of gets things going. It's easy to trade off, and you can use Gravedigger, Urborg Uprising to get some more value out of it later. Just a really solid card, something you're going to want even multiples of in every black deck. So I'm going to give it a B-. Next card is Plague Witch, 1 and a black. It's a 1/1 elf. You can pay 1, tap it, discard a card. Target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn. So because it's an elf, it's okay in elf decks just to fill out the number of elves that you have. Otherwise, I don't like it too much. You're getting a 1/1 for 2, which is weak. And having to spend a mana and a card to give -1/-1 each time, you're already going to be behind 1 card since you paid 2 for a 1/1. So you've got to use 3 mana and 2 cards before you get your first -1/-1 out of it. And I mean, the card that you discard, yeah, could have very possibly been more useful than just giving -1/-1. And if your opponent, like a good situation for this card, right, would be your opponent plays Squadron Hawk and gets a bunch of Hawks. So they have 4 Hawks, and then you can use Plague Witch discard 4 cards and you get to kill all their hawks. But they only had to spend 1 card to get those 4 flyers, and you had to spend 5 cards to kill them. So it's just never really a good card. So even against like a tokens deck, I mean, they're getting multiple tokens for each card they spend, and you're spending 1 card to kill 1 token. So I don't really like it there either. Maybe against elves or some of the blue-white flying decks, if they have a lot of like Mistral Charger, you're happy to trade a card for. And as far as the the ability to discard a card, I don't think there's that much that takes advantage of that. As far as Animate Dead, I think there are better ways to get cards in your graveyard. So I'm really down on Plague Witch, and I'm going to give it a D. Next up is Prowling Pangolin, 3 and 2 black, 6/5. When it enters the battlefield, any player may sacrifice 2 creatures. If they do, you sacrifice Pangolin. So these types of effects where your opponent gets a choice between 2 bad options, I mean, they're always worse than they look. However, with Pangolin, because it's in black, if you use removal on your opponent's creatures, and so they're just left with maybe 1 creature, 0 creatures, or 2 good creatures, then you're going to get the 6/5 out of it. And a 6/5 for 5 is actually huge in this format. And black doesn't have too many win conditions, so for a lot of these slow, grindy, removal-heavy decks, the Pangolin is actually fine. So you're either going to get sort of a 2-for-1 out of it, which is fine because you're just trying to grind your opponent out, or you get a 6/5, and that could be enough to win the game since you're removing all the rest of your opponent's creatures. And I've definitely sided out against red-white tokens, so anything playing Mog War Marshal, Raise the Alarm, where they're making multiple creatures per 1 card, you're not going to want to play the Pangolin, but I think it's serviceable elsewhere, so I'm going to give it a C-. Next up is Sengir Autocrat, 3 and a black. It's a 2/2. When it enters the battlefield, put 3/0/1 Surf tokens into play. And when it leaves the battlefield, exile all Surf tokens. So for 4 mana, you get 4 creatures, and you can chump block with them 1 at a time as long as you chump with the Surfs first. You could also sacrifice them all for effect. So this could put 4 counters on your Carrion Feeder, and puts a lot of creatures in play for a Blood Artist. So you can definitely take advantage of this card, and then you could Gravedigger it back, get a bunch more of the tokens. So yeah, it's a pretty cool card. If you have ways to take advantage of it, it becomes pretty good. If your opponent has a lot of big ground creatures without trample, it's good. If you're facing just a flying deck and you're not taking advantage of the Surf tokens, then I would side it out. But otherwise, yeah, it's good value for 4 mana. So I'm going to give it a C+. Next up is Sinkhole, 2 black sorcery, destroy target land. So this is one of the rare 2 mana land destruction spells, and that makes it better for you curving out. So on turn 2, you put your opponent behind 1 land, and then you get to play your 3-drop while they're playing their 2, and then you play your 4 while they're playing their 3, and it could give you enough tempo to push ahead in the game. It's going to be better in aggressive decks because you're putting your opponent behind on tempo. They're not able to cast their spells as fast while you still can. And you're going 1-for-1. You're killing a land, so you're not losing card advantage by doing so. And it's even not bad in controlling grindy decks, though less exciting there, because usually you're not too interested in stunting your opponent's mana. You kind of just want to eventually out-resource them, and you pretty much want them to just end up with a bunch of lands in play. So spending 1 of your cards to kill 1 land isn't really what you want to do in slower decks. But it can also get rid of a Caracas, or color screw your opponent. If they're 3 colors, you can hit their splash color. So it can do some cool things. If your opponent just kept a landlight hand and you Sinkhole, it might just win the game. So overall, I think it's a solid card and best in aggressive decks. I'm going to give it a C+. Next, we have Skulking Ghost, 1 and a black, 2/1 flying. When it becomes a target of a spell or ability, sacrifice it. So the biggest question with this card is, how much different is it from a Mistral Charger? Mistral Charger I gave a B-2. for the white review, and it's just a very solid card. Every white deck's going to want it. So, how many targeting effects that don't kill 1 toughness creatures are there in this format that your opponents are going to want to use on the Ghost? And, how good is it when they do those? So there's Mana War, Core Hookmaster, Silent Departure, Fervent Cathar, Invigorate, Sting Scourger. So there are cards, Glare of Subdual kills it. There are cards that will kill it that won't kill the Charger. But of those, most of them aren't too punishing. Most of them, you're still trading 1 for 1. You just allowed their card to trade 1 for 1 where it couldn't have otherwise. Some of them, the ones where they're getting a 2/2 creature and killing it, where otherwise they would have just temporarily stalled your creature. I think those are the worst ones, especially Fervent Cathar, since making something not block for a turn isn't that powerful, so being able to kill something instead makes it a lot better. But overall, that's just not that many cards that are different. So in a vacuum, I don't think that the Ghost should be evaluated that much differently than Charger. That said, I think Charger is just so good in white. Like, it just fits white, the blue-white flying archetype, the red-white tokens to pump your creatures deck. So Mistral Charger is just a really good card in white, and therefore just a really good card. But I think the Ghost doesn't fit that well with what Black is trying to do, which is more play a grindy game. Or with Black-Green, you just want to have a ton of elves in play. So I think with Black-Red, a super aggressive deck, one that might play Keldon Marauders, Carrion Feeder, and just try to beat opponent quickly, I think Skulking Ghost is about as good as Mistral Charger in that kind of deck. I think it's rare that you end up with that exact deck, so I think the Ghost is actually going to get a much lower grade. So I'm going to give Ghost a C. Next up, we have one of the best cards in this set, Toxic Deluge, 2 and a black sorcery. As an additional cost to cast it, pay X life. All creatures get -X/-X until end of turn. So for starters, this could be a 3-mana Wrath effect. You do have to pay some life in addition, but the creatures are relatively small in this set, so you're not going to have to pay more than 4 life most of the time. It's worth noting that if your opponent counters Deluge, or if they use, even worse, Memory Lapse, you do still have to pay the life. So it does get a little weaker against blue decks that have counters. But what really puts this card over the top is that you get to target how much you want this effect to do. And that means that if you just have one large creature and your opponent has a large board of smaller creatures, you can just Deluge for 3, and all of their creatures die, and you get to save your large creature. And that is insane to be able to do that. And there's just a lot of different things you can do to set it up. You can make attacks first, so you can attack some, your smaller creature, they block with their bigger creature, and you also have a big creature, you can Deluge to finish off their bigger creature and keep yours. It's just a really flexible card. The flexibility goes down once you're at a really low life total. It might be too late to use, but in that case, you're facing down a big board at a low life total. No card's going to save you in that spot. So the card is just really powerful, and a lot of Wraths get weaker in certain decks, but I don't think Deluge ever gets... I feel like it's a card that you're just never cutting, as long as your opponent's playing creatures. It's just that good. So I'm going to give Deluge an A. Next, we have Tragic Slip. It's 1 black instant. Target creature gets -1/-1 until end of turn. And Morbid, that creature gets -13/-13 until end of turn if a creature died this turn. -13/-13, that's going to kill just about everything. There might be a quadruple elephant-guided creature that maybe would survive that, but it's pretty much kill target creature for 1 mana at that point. So you want to look at this in both scenarios, because you're not always able to kill a creature. It's not that hard to. You just chump with a creature, you use another removal spell on a creature, and then this card is fully powered, 1 mana Terminate. But in the other case where you can't do that, giving a creature -1/-1 for 1 mana is okay. It's generally kind of weak, but it's still okay. It's passable. And then the upside is really huge for the 1 mana, kill anything. So I feel like it balances out to about a B-. But it's a card that you're always going to want to play. Maybe if your opponent only has like a couple big threats, even then I think, nah, you always want to play this card. So I'm going to give it a B-. Next up is Twisted Abomination. 5 and a black. It's a 5/3. You can pay a black to regenerate it, and it has Swamp Cycling. So I've talked about this card quite a bit already. It's amazing to just cycle it and Animate Dead on turn 3. You get the 4/3 regenerator with a mana up. And it's so good to have land cycling on a big creature, because either you just land cycle and you smooth out your draw, or you have plenty of mana, then you get a big creature. And Twisted Abomination is actually really, really powerful in play. 5/3 regeneration attacks through just about anything in this format. So your opponent is very quickly going to need to chump it. And it also blocks and kills just about anything in this format. So it's a great creature to have in play. And again, the fact that you can just swamp cycle it means that there's not quite the cost of having to put 6 drops in your deck, like there is with something like Phyrexian Gargantua or 7 drops Havoc Demon, where you never get to 6 or 7 mana, the card's a dead card. But Abomination, that's just not going to happen, so it's totally fine to play multiples of this card. And if you get multiple in play, you just attack with 1 and leave the other one back to block every turn, and you pretty much have the board, taken. And your opponent has to have something like Pacifism, Swords to Plowshares. There's only so many ways to actually deal with it if you've got regeneration mana up. So the card's actually very powerful, great finisher, and just really smooth on your deck. So I'm going to give Twisted A-Bomb a B for A-Bomb. Next up, Urborg Uprising. 4 and a black, sorcery. Return up to 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand, and draw a card. So this card doesn't affect the board the turn you play it, and it costs 5 mana. So already it's a little bit sketchy. If your opponent's beating you down, you might not have time to play this card and get value out of it. It also requires you to have 2 creature cards in your graveyard to get the full value out of it. But if you do, it starts at a 3-for-1. And if the cards you're getting back have inherent card advantage, like if you get back a Gravedigger, a Nekrataal, it only goes up from there. So if you're a grindy deck and you're facing another grindy deck, this card is actually insane. You just go 1-for-1 with your opponents a bunch of times. You play a threat, they kill it. They play a threat, you kill it. And eventually, you're down to just 1 or 2 cards in your hand. If you play Urborg Uprising, you get to just start over again. And your opponent is so far behind at that point. So it's a really key card in those matchups. And if your deck is designed to play that kind of game, then you're definitely going to want at least 1 Uprising. If you're playing against a more aggressive deck, you might just side it out. And also, playing a second one starts to get a little iffy. Like if you draw both and you don't draw the good creatures you need, then that can be pretty bad. So I usually like to play 1, but if you are in one of those really grindy matchups, I think it's perfectly reasonable to side in a second. So I'm going to give Uprising a C+. Next up is Vampiric Tutor. It's 1 black instant. Search your library for a card, then shuffle your library and put that card on top of it. You lose 2 life. So worth noting, you do not need to show this card to your opponent, unlike the other tutors in this set. I guess Gamble you don't have to as well. But unlike Enlightened and Mystical Tutor, that's a mistake I make all the time, so don't be like me. Now, this card suffers from the same issues that the other tutors do, in that you are down a card to cast it, so you have to consider that the card you're getting loses a lot of its actual value, given that you're minus 1 card. And you're minus a bit of initiative, because you had to spend this 1 black mana and maybe a turn before you get that other card. And this one you also lose 2 life, so again, black cards, a lot of them lose life. You can only play so many before there start to be diminishing returns. But Vampiric Tutor is definitely better than the other tutors. I mentioned how Enlightened Tutor seems better in this set because there are some really amazing enchantments that you can get. compared to Mystical Tutor, which there's just not as many great things you can get with it. Well, Vampiric Tutor can get anything, and so that just, really increases the number of insane bombs that you can get with the card. So you can get all the same cards you get with the Lightning Tutor, but you can also grab a Visara, and you can also grab a land with it. And while it never feels great to get a land with it, because you are down a card, and you're using your Vampiric Tutor, which could get you the best card in your deck, you're throwing that away, and you're just getting a land. If you had one of the other tutors, you couldn't even cast them because you deny yourself a land the next turn. So that gives you a lot more flexibility with this tutor, and actually makes it quite a strong card. It is going to be dependent on what cards are actually in your deck, but if you're drafting, you're going to pick good cards, right? So you'll probably have enough that this card's going to be not only just playable. I don't think you're ever going to cut it from your deck, but it's actually going to be quite good. So I'm going to give Vampiric Tutor a B. Next up is Victimize. 2 and a black, sorcery. Choose two target creature cards in your graveyard. Sacrifice a creature. If you do, return the chosen cards to the battlefield tapped. So you have to have 2 creatures in your graveyard to target when you cast this card. And then you have to have a 3rd creature in play that you're not able to bring back with the Victimize. So, this is a very situational card, but it does actually have a higher upside than a card like Animate Dead, because you get 2 creatures back. So if you have 2, large bomb creatures in your graveyard, you double up with the Victimize, just sacrificing whatever your worst creature is. And black has a lot of, and the set in general has a lot of creatures with come to play abilities, so those are good to sacrifice for the effect, and they're also good to get back with the effect. So the black-white Gravedigger Flicker deck, I think Victimize is going to be a great fit there, because you're just going to have a lot of come to play abilities. And, if you just sacrifice a white man line or a Phyrexian Rager to get, 2 creatures like Nekrataal, maybe a fatty back, that's very powerful value play. So I feel like this card is actually closer to Urborg Uprising. It's more down that line of just a good value card for the later game than Animate Dead, which is, I think, a lot more flexible. So I don't think it's as good as Animate Dead. But if you have the right deck, it actually can provide a lot of value. But I don't feel like I'm going to play it in your average black deck, because you do have to have 2 creatures in your graveyard, and you do have to have 1 creature in play, and that's not always the case. So I'm going to give Victimize a C+. Next up, we have another favorite of mine, Visara the Dreadful. 3 and 3 black, 5/5 legend, flying, and you can tap to destroy target creature. It can't be regenerated. So if you cast Visara and you untap with her, you basically win the game. So your opponent needs to remove it, otherwise you just destroy their best creature every turn, and you even have a 5/5 flying blocking creature while you're doing that. And the turn you play it, you have a 5/5 flying creature to block, so it's very hard to beat. If you're facing a Visara, you can try Silent Departure, then flash it back. If you've got enough if you have enough attackers on board, maybe you can finish them before they can actually untap with it. And then there's Pacifism, Swords of Plowshares, if Eye Blight's ending, and then if you have something like Second Thoughts, you can let them finish off all your creatures, and then when they attack with Visara, you can Second Thoughts it, and you might still lose that game. So Visara is really, really good. There's some cards that... Oh, did I mention Pacifism? Pacifism's not the best... I think I did. Pacifism's not the best answer to Visara. That's not a very good one. Just a really insanely powerful card. I think it is the best of this cycle of 6 mana legends. It just has the biggest effects on the game in the widest variety of situations. And then is also in a color with Animate Dead, so you can discard it and get it out early. So, and then if it dies, you can get it back with reanimation. So, really good card in this set. So I'm going to give Visara an A. Next up, we have Wake of Vultures, 3 and a black, 3/1 flying. You can pay 1 and a black, sacrifice a creature to regenerate it. So, It's a 3 power flyer for 4 mana, and that gets a pretty reasonable clock for its price. If you cast it on turn 4, it is susceptible to any ping, 1 damage removal, which is not great for your 4-drop. But its ability works pretty well with the card, because 3/1 very frequently will trade with a creature it deals damage to, and you can just instead sacrifice your worst creature to regenerate Wake. So what it'll look like is your opponent attacks with 5/5 and a 3/3. And they'll never make this attack because you have Wake. But if they did, you block the 5/5 with your 1/1, you block Wake on their 3/3, you sack the 1/1 to the Wake, and you basically traded their 3/3 for your 1/1. So the card actually blocks pretty well. It sets up some good blocking situations. And then, it attacks well, 3 power flying. So it's overall a reasonable card. I mean, a lot of the black decks I like have a low creature count, and so don't have too many creatures sitting around to sacrifice to it. But in the black-red Aristocrats deck, this card's going to be great. And its stats are such that it's reasonable to put in just about any deck, but best in aggressive decks, and as a way to protect your creatures from exile or passive effects so you can keep reanimating them. So I'm going to give Wake of Vultures a C-. And our last black card is Wakedancer. 2 and a black. It's a 2/2 with Morbid. When it enters the battlefield, if a creature died this turn, put a 2/2 black zombie creature token onto the battlefield. So the upside of this card is paying 3 mana for 2 2/2s. And that's a really fine rate. Frequently it costs around 4 mana with some kind of bonus to get 2 2/2s. So for 3 mana, that's really good. So it's how often are we able to trigger that? If you have a Mogg War Marshal on turn 2, you can just not pay Echo, and then Wakedancer comes out as the 2 2/2s, and then you've got 4 creatures in play on turn 3. So that's a really nice combo. And the red-black Aristocrats deck can pull those kinds of things off pretty well, and make Wakedancer quite a fine card in those decks. It's also fine in the black-white Flicker deck. You want to be trading creatures a lot and reanimating things. And Wakedancer is just a nice value card in that case. You can also, if you have a lot of removal, just play a removal spell, play Wakedancer in the same turn. So for 6 mana, you Eyeblight's Ending something, you play Wakedancer, get a couple 2/2s. That's a pretty nice play. And the floor on the card is a 2/2 for 3, which is certainly bad in such a high-powered format, but it's still something that can trade. It's not the worst-case scenario for spending a card. So even that is okay. So overall, I'm going to give Wakedancer a C. So that's going to do it for black. If you've noticed by the grades, I've graded black cards pretty highly. That's because I think black is really good in this format. There's just so many great cards, so many ways to get card advantage, a ton of great 2-for-1s, great removal, some good creatures, some great bombs, and makes for a grindy playstyle that I like, because the more turns the game goes, the more opportunities the better player has to take advantage of their skill edge. So I like playing really long, grindy games, and black really works well for that. It combines well with red for the Aristocrats deck, or just like a slow control deck, and you can move it into 3 colors like black, white, red, or black, red, blue. With blue, black, you're just playing such strong cards, you can just make a nice control deck, maybe with a little bit of a reanimation theme. Black, white, you get the flicker, take advantage of come to play effects and reanimation. And black, green, it's more of a green deck, it's really the elf deck, and with black as being a little bit of support, and that's fine also. So I think black is in a really good spot in this set. And that'll do it for me today. Make sure to come back. I'm going to be doing the red cards for Tonal Masters next, and I'll be going all the way through gold, artifacts, and lands. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.